Hello, this is Chris Chappell. I'm delighted to be included in this conversation, and I'm the Doshi Professor of Indic and Comparative Theology and the Director of the Master of Arts in Yoga Studies at Loyola Marymount University. And what I propose to do for the next several minutes is to talk about the history of yoga leading up to our current state, and then share some reflections in terms of the current really reception of yoga and understandings of yoga, and maybe think about some prospects for the future. And I want to first self-identify as a scholar practitioner with a little slight autobiographical narrative that I learned about yoga in really high school. And I was sort of driven into an asana practice by a rather compromised physical condition, a little bit of scoliosis, a big scoliosis that fortunately through many years of practice is resolved. And right from the beginning, having grown up in the era of psychology today and the whole emergence of the conversations about somatic psychology, saw the connection between body and emotion and thoughts, and identified yoga early on as the gateway into a state of greater well-being. And that journey included the studies of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, of the yogas of Naropa, of the wonderful books that were published by Evans Wentz, and reading Carl Jung, reading Ram Dass and Be Here Now, and also very early on, while still in high school, reading the discourses and other publications by Meher Baba. And I credit Meher Baba with outlining very succinctly the whole theory of samskara and vasana, and the interlacing of karma with the human condition, and the encouragement that through meditation that a sense of purification can come about. And with that as my backdrop, I launched into college, and very first semester was drawn into the language foundation for grasping what is at stake with Indian philosophy and Asian philosophy writ large. So this is where the scholar part comes in, is that my very first yoga classes, asana yoga classes, were with 3HO people. And my very first Sanskrit encounters were with disciples of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Prabhu Prabhupada, and entailed the recitation through the full semester, my first semester of freshman year, of the Bhagavad Gita, and entering into philosophical conversations and theological conversations, both with my classmates and with my professors. And during that time, discovering a newly established yoga study center in Amityville, New York, transferring university in order to be there. And then while studying at Stony Brook, taking up the philosophical and the linguistic immersion in both the Sanskrit language and the Tibetan language, all the while reflecting about self. And by that I mean both the miserable teenager self emerging into young adulthood, and also the self of the amazing quiet that was gifted through collective experiences of the practice of yoga and meditation. And this journey, which is still unfolding, led eventually to my own establishment of a center for the study of yoga and meditation called the Hill Street Center in Santa Monica, California, as well as leading various practice retreats, and then integrating the practice aspects of yoga into the way that we communicate the study of yoga here at Loyola Marymount University. So that's my sort of feminist theology way of emplacing myself within the discourse. And now what I want to do is to share just a little bit of the controversy of how do we have the audacity to think that we can even make strong historical claims about the origins of yoga, and then move through various periods of history where we in fact do learn that we can make positive statements based on archaeological evidence, based on textual evidence. And then right up to the present, we have the lives of real-time people living yoga, practicing yoga, and teaching yoga. And we'll offer a little bit of reflections here about, sort of the state of affairs. So if we go all the way back, and for many of you, this is reviewing something that you probably know all too well. But we know that from the early archaeology that was conducted in the 1920s and continues primarily, well, in both the Pakistan side of the border with Mark Knoyer, as well as on the Indian side of the border with people such as my Los Angeles colleague at UCLA, Monica Smith, that there have been large numbers of people, communities living in India for a very long time. And from a period of about a couple thousand years, from about 3,500 to 1,500, there were cities crafted of terracotta and laid out on a grid that exhibited mastery of hydrology. These cities had running water and plumbing and sewerage. These cities also had factories that produced jewelry. And they also were active in trade, both with Egypt and with Samaria, and all through the area of Central Asia, including over into Persia, modern-day Iran. And this cultural continuum stretched from really the area of Pakistan up into Afghanistan, and then over into the Gangetic Plain. The number of cities that are identified are very extensive, and the overall settlement area, most likely, or the archaeologists have confirmed, exceeded the population levels that could be detected in the Middle East or in Egypt. And the jury is still out in terms of both Thailand and China during this early period. And from the ruins of these cities, we have some images that indicate that animals were revered and cared for and played a very important role, not only in the food life of people and the sort of the material life of people, but given the way many of them are lovingly rendered or reverently rendered with a sense of awe, particularly when it comes to some of the very dangerous animals, that we know that there was a very deep emotional relationship with animals in India from a very early period that went beyond their mere utility. So number one, animals. Second, there is wide and diverse evidence of veneration of the female form and the capacity, particularly of the female, to give birth. And we see what the archaeologists call goddess figurines in abundance. And just as we have a carry-through with animal reverence in India, where it's just commonplace to see cows, camels, elephants, just interwoven with human activity, so also through the course of Indian history, there was never, it had happened in the Middle East, the close down of the veneration of the goddess, but merely an enhancement and a refinement and a switch of expression, first from the terracottas into, some years later, the statuary form that perhaps was inspired by the Greeks, then into temple forms, as well as into textual veneration. And now, of course, it's through the plastic media of film Santoshi Ma, one of the great films of the early part of the 20th century, which created the worship of a goddess through the medium of film, and then website. And there's been many, many studies of how the goddess and how all of the gods, in fact, have found a home for worship through this medium called the computer and the internet. So cities, management of water, reverence of animals. The month of January in Tamil Nadu in South India, every year, every animal gets the day off, gets garlanded with flowers, gets polka dots, and animal and human alike will share in a very special sweet rice dish called pongal. And then the piece that is topical for this conference is the depiction of what appear to be yogis. And the seals depict sometimes someone with a headdress, sometimes actual small statues. This one with a trefoil, sort of a shamrock costume. Guy looks a little bit like me, without glasses, but is bearded, bald, and discernibly meditative. And then there are some figures surrounded with animals that find expression similarly thousands of years later in the thousand-pillared halls of South India. I've seen them in various places from 1,000 years ago, where you see what is the god known as Pashupati, or the Lord, the Pati of the Pashus, of all of the animals. And this god becomes identified with Rudra from the Vedas and with Shiva, as we know Shiva today. And so there is what is called the proto-Shiva seal from early India, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Indus Valley. And these seals show up as well over in Samaria and in Egypt due to the active trade between these various communities. Now, some have speculated that this original fabric of proto-yoga was shared throughout the Indo-European linguistic world, but other scholars have posited that as this culture around 1500 began to fade, and although cities continued and settlements continued to be built upon the ruins of these magnificent landscapes that had been crafted by humans so many thousands of years ago, there was a shift from that discernible material culture into a period where what seems to be happening is shifting more inland and southward into the peninsula. And the culture, rather than being a material culture based in the crafting of terracotta, shifts into the widespread use of vegetable and tree matter for the recording and for the crafting and for the artistry. And this period lasts for about 1,200 years, from 1500 to 1200. And during that period, we also have the emergence from the northwest of India of a group of wandering sages called rishis, who composed 1,008 hymns known as the Rig Veda that were built during this period of about 1500 to 900. And there are wonderful scholars such as Michael Witzel at Harvard University, who has written extensively on the content. Translators going back to even the 19th century, Wilson, and then the most recent translation is published by Stephanie Jameson at UCLA, and in collaboration with Joel Brereton at the University of Texas, excellent Sanskrit scholars of Vedic literature. And this sort of presents a worldview that brings into high relief aspects of world-body engagement that carry over into themes that we see articulated in the yoga tradition. So this Vedic literature uses the word yoga, but it uses the word yoga in terms of describing a primary activity of these Indo-European people and these Vedic people. And this was the yoke, the yoga, that connects the chariot, the ratha, to the horses, to the horse, to the ashva. And in between, we have the agency of the human being. And this becomes both a metaphor and a trope, philosophically. So the metaphor is that the human being is able to harness the stuff of life, the action organs, the sense organs, and direct the human endeavor in one way or another through this connection. So this is describing a very physical process. And that metaphor, of course, extends many years later, or maybe it was around the same period of time. We don't know a good way to date the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita, but recall that the known early discourse on yoga called the Bhagavad Gita took place on a chariot where Arjuna was sitting and Krishna was serving as the charioteer, yoked to the horses that were being held in reserve before action was to be undertaken. So this is not only an early appearance of the word yoga as philosophy, but it's also a very visual representation of what does it mean to be yoked, to be held,